Greetings, fellow tarot travelers, tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch. Well, I suppose everybody's heard about the Sri Lankan bombings, the terrorist attack on April 20th that occurred in Sri Lanka, where 8 male suicide bombers and 1 female suicide bomber attacked multiple buildings, mostly Catholic churches and luxury hotels in the cities of Colombo, Negombo, and Batikola. There were 3 churches hit and 4 luxury hotels hit, and there were 2 more bombs found, one near the airport and one at the house raided by the police. Well, ISIS accepted responsibility on Amaq news agency, their news agency. But there's a lot of problems with the ISIS accepting of responsibility. They released a photograph of men heavily cloaked, and then they had a video of men heavily cloaked. We never really see most of their faces, and we're not sure if this video has anything to do with the actual bombing. But according to ISIS's manifesto, any organization that commits an act of terrorism and is simply inspired by ISIS, ISIS will then accept responsibility. And this is really interesting, I think, because if that's ISIS's ideology, let's extend it further. Who is ISIS inspired by? And it turns out ISIS is inspired, as is Al-Qaeda and most of the Islamicist terrorist organizations, by Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi Salafist ideology, which is a fundamentalist form of Islam that seems to be propagating the ideology that creates all these satellite terrorist organizations. And the Saudis are spending billions of dollars annually propagating this ideology of fundamentalist Islamist beliefs. In the wake of this most recent terrorist attack, which turned out to be the biggest terrorist bombing and with the highest death toll of any attack outside of Syria and Iraq since the World Trade Towers. So this isn't a small deal, folks. It's a big, big deal. Even Sri Lanka's top police official and defense secretary have resigned for failing to act upon reports that a terrorist plot was imminent. And whereas the New Zealand attack was a lone wolf attack in Christchurch, the Sri Lankan attack was an organized, planned, military attack on unarmed civilians. I mean, it really goes against, ethics of war. It is a war crime because it was an act of war. And it definitely involved big money and a lot more people than just the 9 terrorists. There's a lot of people to provide the safe house, to provide the bomb-making material, to provide food, to provide surveillance. And this could be as many as 50 to 100 people involved in this process. And so the way these terrorist cells work, there's a smaller group from Sri Lanka that the government wants to pin this on, but it really comes down to ISIS and it comes down to Saudi Arabia ultimately. And wasn't Saudi Arabia somehow involved with the trade tower bombings as well? I mean, maybe we should look a little closer at Saudi Arabia. Now, the cards I'm going to use today to analyze this whole situation is a Marseille deck, and it is called the Tarot du Nisanka. And this deck is so interesting because it is done with directionality of a Marseille deck. So if the Queen of Wands is looking one way, in this deck she's looking in the same direction. And so it's a real authentic Marseille style deck. It's just done in a motif of Sri Lankan art, done for the King of Sri Lanka, who founded the contemporary government as a Buddhist government. So let's look and see what the cards have to say about the recent spate of terrorism in Sri Lanka. We're all very concerned. And, the Buddhists, I'll say one thing about them, they're very open-minded. They have Hindus, Christians, Muslims in their society. They're very open-minded and good people. And you don't find that in the Muslim world. Oh no, in the Muslim world, only Muslims are allowed to live in Saudi Arabia or any of the Muslim countries. When they get power, they don't share their power. But the Buddhists and, many other religions do. They're more open-minded about such things. And, maybe they're regretting that now in Sri Lanka. Well, let's see what the cards have to say. The first card is the Four of Swords. Well, the Four of Swords is a very interesting card. And it has to do with restrictions and being able to deal with certain restrictions. The next card, another, I shuffle these cards before the show and I shuffle them during the show. So, this is how they want to arise. Here we have the Eight of Swords, which means to protect something precious. And then we have the Roi de Coupe, the King of Cups. I just adore this deck. It's so beautiful. And so non-traditional, but yet still, like I say, the King of Cups is facing the same way as in a traditional Marseille deck with almost the identical body posture. So what does this all mean? Well, we have two air signs, and we are seeing that the cards ascend from 4 to 8 to a court card. So the reading is actually propitious and positive and good and supportive. It's not speaking of tragedy, it's speaking of goodness. And we have here restrictions. And the air signs, these are both air signs. The swords are air and the cup is water. Air signs deal with information and intellect. So we're dealing with intellectual restrictions and we're dealing with the intellectual property or the intellectual protection, the idea of protecting something precious. And so what I would think looking at these cards is, there's going to be a lot of, a lot of cause and effect going on because of this terrorism. It's definitely going to affect Myanmar's elections and India's elections. Just watch anti-Islamic groups rise to power in much of Asia because no country wants to go through this. And the Muslims have a horrible track record. Like 90% of all terrorism's committed by Muslims. And they've defaced Buddhist statues in Bimian and in Borobudur, and they've done it also in Sri Lanka. In fact, one of the terrorists who committed this horrible act in Sri Lanka had been arrested previously for defacing Buddhist statues. They don't even understand Buddhism and they're against it. So what I see here is that there's going to be a rise in restrictionism. If the Muslims can apply a jizya tax on foreign religionists that are in their lands, well, let's face it, Muslims are very expensive if they cause terrorism. They're not just the expense emotionally to people's lives, but missing incomes and families, ruined buildings, and increased security. All this costs money. And so we're going to see some restrictions here going up on the Muslims in Sri Lanka and possibly elsewhere because they're protecting something precious. It's not just life. In Sri Lanka, they're also protecting Buddhism, and they also have Hinduism and Christianity to protect as well. These are very old, noble institutions. And although Sri Lanka has had a civil war with the Tamils, both the Tamils and the Buddhists have ancient claims to the island of Sri Lanka. The Muslims have a vague connection. They want to think that the underwater submerged land bridge of rocks that Rama put out to help conquer Sri Lanka to get back his wife Sita is somehow Adam's bridge, and they misconstrue it to be part of the Garden of Eden, which just doesn't make any sense geographically or on any other level. So their ties are tenuous at best, and the same for the Christians. So the thing that's precious that needs to be protected is what we would call the Dharma cultures of Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And here we see that the King of Cups in the future, he's going to be looking the other way. He's looking away from the restrictions and from the protecting of the innocent and the important ancient religious institutions of the region. He's going to be looking away, and we're going to see him be more permissive, that the government's going to be more permissive of the police searching, seizing, of the military checking at the airports, people's passports being reviewed regularly, and people being rounded up, and mosques being searched. And he's just going to look the other way. And we're going to find this happening not just in Sri Lanka, but in many other places. And so the cards speak of a karmic reaction, which is what cups are about. Whereas the air signs are acting existentially in the present, the cups are more about a retributive karmic reaction to circumstances, and even a more long-term reaction to circumstances. And so what we see here is that, restrictions will be applied immediately. They need to protect the citizenry and the religious institutions and the economic sector, all the luxury hotels and the airport. And these things need to be protected immediately. And in the long term, we may even see a purge of Muslims from the island of Sri Lanka and other regions, like in Myanmar and possibly in parts of India and other places, because of this sociological problem of them having to assert themselves in non-peaceful ways and to impose their laws upon regions and to take over regions and governments. I'm not opposed myself to the religious practice of Islam. I'm opposed to terrorism, and I'm opposed to taking over regions. Nobody wants to be under anybody else's thumb. And in many ways, that's why I admire a Buddhist government like the one in Sri Lanka, because the Buddhists are very open people in general. Now, it doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, but among the societies of the world that are religious, they are one of the more open societies, more permissive than most. And that's a good thing. It allows multiple religions to foster in the region, and it teaches people to get along peacefully. And, I think that's what the King of Cups is about. I think it's about teaching people to live with each other peacefully. And that's why they're going to be very protectionistic, and they're going to have high restrictions on travel and on, people can't just float in from Dubai with strange-looking suitcases anymore. And mosques can't just be operating with a lot of inflaming rhetoric any longer. These things are going to be dealt with. The swords are highly militaristic. They are, attack and kill suit. That's what the swords are about. But the Roi de Coupe is the great mediator, the great leader of peace, the one who is truly concerned with the best interests of all parties involved. And even though he's turning a blind eye to what the military and police will start enacting and the government will start enacting, in the long run, there'll be greater peace, greater regional stability, and a better economy for the people of Sri Lanka and other governments that follow suit, because something needs to be done.